last week we tried to summarize in a very brief way, I guess, not all the world's religions, because we left out the Native American indigenous side of things. And if we had more time, I would love to have included that. And we just sort of summarized in very brief terms what the major world religions were like structurally. Think of religious traditions as ways of structuring your existence. Okay? They give you a worldview. They give you an ethical system, which incidentally, across all the world's religions, the ethical systems are very similar, if not almost identical. They're all about nonviolence. Here we go, you know. But today we're going to talk about how do you enter into dialogue with these traditions. Now, I'm not going to tell you there's only one way, because there isn't, okay? But I'd like to sort of think about the structure of interreligious dialogue, what a dialogue is really like structurally, and then we can open it up for conversation. How does that sound? Yeah. Okay, all right. Don't let me die up here now. Come on. Most religious conversations between human beings in the same tradition or between human beings talking from different traditions are monologue. Okay? They really represent our own understanding, and we listen to other people, but we don't really enter into a dialogue with them. We stay in our own tradition and say, oh, that's nice, or oh, that's wrong, or oh, that's indifferent, or oh, we're the same, without ever thinking critically about that. But it might be helpful to sketch briefly what a dialogue is, especially in the realm of interreligious stuff. Okay. The first point I want to make is that interreligious dialogue is a specific type of conversation between faithful people representing different traditions. Okay? And it happens without ulterior motives. You don't enter a dialogue with somebody simply because you want to convert them to your point of view. That's not a dialogue, that's a monologue. Or if you're a missionary, that's an attempt to get people into your own tradition. Dialogue isn't about that. It's about being open to what's there. Lack of interior motives is perhaps the most important element of an interreligious dialogue. It's a way of mutually sharing experiences, ideas, a history, events in the past with each other, so you can listen and be open to what's going on in the conversation. It might, in fact, inform your own worldview. It might even change your own worldview. You need to be open to that. No ulterior motives. It's not a missionary enterprise. Sharing our faith perspective with people whose perspective is different than our own is a way of transforming our conversations into an open dialogue and escapes all the missionary stuff. Now, I'm not against missionary stuff, but if you're in a dialogue, you're not doing that. Okay? The second thing is genuine interreligious dialogue requires being engaged with the faith and perspectives and ideas of the person to whom we are in dialogue. Okay? When I'm dialoguing with my partner, Mark Uno, who teaches at University of Oregon, he's a Buddhist. I'm not. He calls me a Lubu, a Lutheran Buddhist, because he's a Bulu. Because when we talk, we're sharing ideas, and I'm listening to him with intent, because he's a very bright guy. And apparently he's doing the same with me. And our perspectives have been stretched, tested, and changed. I'm not the same kind of Lutheran I was before I met Mark as I am afterwards. Okay, I'm still a Lutheran, although I have Lutheran friends who deny that. But it's a way of being open to what's there in the world, uh, uh, and also to have our faith perspectives challenged as well as stretched. Because it's going to happen if you're in an honest dialogue. You can't escape it. Now, but the third thing is, interreligious dialogue requires that you know your own tradition well. You know its teachings, its practices, its worldview, because it's part of who you are. But it means getting a critical hold of that so you can have a conversation from that perspective. Do you follow? It doesn't mean you're trying to convert this person to your perspective. You can't talk to anybody unless you know what you're talking about. Okay? And that's a very key problem. And the last thing I want to share with you is that interreligious dialogue requires us to think of truth as relational. Okay, whatever the truth is, it's a relationship. From scientific accounts to the physical realities underlying the universe, to social scientific theories, to theological explorations of our religious traditions, we can only understand anything from the perspective we occupy at the moment we understand something. Okay, it's a relationship. For this reasons, Carmelite nuns, for example, practicing contemplative prayer, do not ordinarily experience the Buddha nature underlying all things and events at every moment of space-time. Okay, nor do Zen Buddhist nuns ordinarily experience mystical union with Christ the bridegroom as a result of their meditative practice. No one and no religious tradition can endorse the whole of reality, the way things really are, as opposed to the way we hope or want things to be, within its particular institutional and doctrinal boundaries. Dialogue reveals that the faith and practice of another human being can challenge, stretch, enliven our particular self-awareness as religious persons. And we need to flow, as my Taoist friends would say, we need to flow with that encounter and seek the balance between extremes, because that's where life is lived. You follow? Okay. Now, this is the last thing. The practice of interreligious dialogue requires taking a risk. Okay, it's a very risky thing. This is why most people don't practice dialogue. It's not for the spiritually timid. Okay, openness to the insights of persons living in the depths of religious traditions other than your own. Okay, is a kind of odyssey, which one of my favorite theologians, John Donne, now not the old John Donne who lived in the 60s, but John S. Donne, who's a Jesuit teaching at Notre Dame, he described as passing over and returning. In dialogue, you enter a process of passing over into the traditions of other people and then returning to your own position, stretched, newly identified, newly evolved. You follow? So, but most of the time, Christians who pass over into the Buddhist way, for example, return as Christians who learned something about Buddhism. Other times, Christians will incorporate what they've discovered in Buddhism into their own Christian understanding. Okay, that's why Mark calls me a Lubu. Okay, but sometimes you pass over into another tradition and you come back with a dual identity. You're both Christian and Buddhist at the same time and don't experience that as a conflict. And sometimes you leave your tradition and become part of the tradition with which you enter dialogue. Dialogue is a process that's not for the faint-hearted, but it's for people who are secure and intellectually excited about this and who are rooted in their own tradition. But it's an adventure in which things change, and you can't predict how it's going to change before it happens. That's the basic idea. You follow? Okay. Now, this is where I want to leave it open to you for discussion. Feel free to talk about last week or talk about what you think dialogue is or your own experiences of it. And if you're willing to share all that, that'll make this class a success. If not, I haven't earned my money. So, okay. So it's now, what do you think? What reactions, what conversations do you want to bring up? Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, well,
There's a microphone.
oh, I'm sorry. I wish that we had more dialogue with the world so that we didn't have so many killings
Well,
needlessly.
Yeah, I agree with that. To be in dialogue means you've got to set aside all your hostility. I can't talk to, here's an example. There's a sectarian movement in Buddhism called Soka Gakkai. It's based on a Buddhist text, but it's a very fundamentalist form of Buddhism, which you do not see very often. And those people drive me crazy. They've got the only truth, they say, and to really be awakened, enlightened, you got to take it from their perspective. Okay. And I have the same reaction to that I do with the fundamentalist Christians because they think they have the only way. Or you've met people in your own church, I suspect, who suspect this is the only way. And I'm sorry, I did it again. And he wants me to stay here and behave myself. Yeah. So, some people you just can't do it because they're not ready to do it. It takes people who are comfortable enough in their own faith. They can see charlatans whenever they arise, and they're not going to be in dialogue. Those are people that you have to confront. But in dialogue, you don't confront, you listen. And they listen to you if it's a real dialogue. Very hard to find a dialogue because sometimes, most of the time, the people you're talking to aren't interested. Okay? Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah.
It didn't help?
No, it helps, but also I think that in addition to dialogue between the greatly different traditions, like Christians and Buddhists, there needs to be the dialogue within each individual tradition. I mean, the differences between the different sects of the Muslims and the Christians and Jews, all of the major divisions have subdivisions in them that also need to have dialogues back and forth.
Well, exactly. I was going to get to that point. Thank you. But that's absolutely true. Um, I have an easy time dialoguing with my Methodist friends because I went to a Methodist seminary and I know them well and all that stuff. I have easy time dialoguing with Jesuits because they're so darn bright, you know. I have an easy time dialoguing with Presbyterians, although they will say it's predestined, which I don't really accept. Oh. But we'll talk about it, you know. But somebody who's really in one of these right-wing religious groups, they're not interested in dialogue, and you can't really talk to them. And so I just try to avoid conversations with them. Because what they do is not particularly Christian from my point of view. Okay? It's not particularly faithful. For me, I agree with Luther. You don't argue yourself into a state of faith. You find yourself in one, and then try to explain what the hell it is that you found yourself in. Okay? That's what theology is. That's what it was for Luther. I mean, can you believe this? Luther's in a thunderstorm, gets knocked on his rear end, and discovers, wait, here's this thing, and it says, just go with the flow. You don't have to argue yourself. You're already saved. Figure out what it means. And he did. And he broke from the Catholic Church because the structures he came up with didn't fit in with his experiences. And he was one of the first people in the Middle Ages that said faith starts with experience. Okay? And he was dead on about that. Now, so were the other reformers. You know, John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley, I love their hymns because they like to ride on horses and go from place to place. And you sing a Charles Wesley hymn, it sounds like you're riding a horse. You know? But they had the same, they said the same thing, but they had a hard time dialoguing with other Christians. Okay. And I suspect the hardest dialogue you will have will be people whose theology is different than your own, whose faith tradition is different than your own. Because there's a lot of stuff out there you have to kind of find and get into, and it isn't easy. It isn't easy. It's easier to dialogue with a Buddhist because you know what you're getting into, or with a Muslim, you know what you're getting into. Okay. Some Muslims don't care about dialogue, others do. The Muslims I know are very interested because they see Christianity as part of the Islamic tradition. You'd be surprised how many references there are to Christian faith in the Quran. Okay, that's because there were a number of Christian tribes in Muhammad's day, and they were the first converts because they were getting persecuted by the Orthodox churches because they weren't Orthodox. They were tribal. And Muhammad just sucked them in. Other groups who weren't Muslim but who were Christians saw this justice that Islam stresses and saw the openness to ideas and the Quranic injunction not to persecute people for their religious ideas and practices as a source for their own understanding of why they became Muslim. A Muslim is simply someone who surrenders to God's will. Okay? So Muslims are very open to dialogue. When you talk to one, he's not trying to make you a Muslim. That's up to God. You know, that's how they put it. Okay? Jewish people, the Jewish people I know, are not missionaries at all. They're just trying to survive. Okay, but they will talk to you, and they will share with you. And if you're in conversation with them, they want to hear what you have to say, and there's a nice conversation. I have a brother-in-law who's a Reformed Jew, and we have very interesting conversations about religious matters and politics and all that stuff. And I don't care if he becomes a Christian. He doesn't care if I become a Jew. We just love each other enough to have this conversation. Dialogue happens in a kind of relationship that we call agape, love. Okay? And if it doesn't, it's not a dialogue, it becomes a monologue. And it's very hard to not slip into that monological perspective. Okay? But if you don't, I'll tell you, the world opens up in ways you can't imagine. That's why I did what I did for 44 years. Okay? What else? I'm lecturing, I'm sorry. Yes.
by a tribal, just talking to somebody or being fitting in on it or something, that you forget who you are and what you believe in, and you're just kind of swept away. And then when you wake up, it's like, what did I just do?
I don't get swept away, but I'm very much open to it. I've written a novel called Raven Games, and it's based on Haida mythology. And I love Native American stuff. I just didn't think I had time to talk about it here, because I was instructed, do the world's religions, the major ones, and I always do as I'm told. So well, most of the time.
It's just such a feeling, though. It's like I feel like I've, turned against my religion by accepting, and just being in the atmosphere is so overpowering. I couldn't resist it.
You haven't turned against your religion. You've recognized the humanity in these folks, and you've entered into their experiences. It's made you a less parochial Lutheran. And that's what dialogue does. Okay? You don't have to give up your own tradition. Now, but there's always that chance. I have a friend who is a Roman Catholic, okay? And he's one of the leading people in Buddhist Christian dialogue studies. And he got into the Zen tradition so deeply, okay, that he's incorporated the Zen ideas like impermanence, samsara, nirvana, all that stuff into his own theology, that you can't recognize the Jesuit training he had. Okay. And yet it was a Jesuit training that opened him up to this stuff. Okay. So he's my example of a Christian Buddhist. Okay. A Catholic Buddhist. He hasn't quite understood Luther yet, but we'll get to him, those sorts of things happen all the time. Now, I can't, how can I say? I have we had a teacher in seminary named, I can't remember his name. Abe Masao, okay? And he was a Zen layperson, and he was a philosopher, and he was as close to making Buddhism and kind of an imperial religion, like some Christians make Christianity. You're really not human unless you're part of this tradition. He was the only Buddhist I ever met who did that. And he taught that way, and he practiced Zen, which is a strange thing, because in Zen, you don't talk about doctrine. You sit facing a wall and shut your mouth and meditate. That's basically that. And then then the master will ask you weird questions that have nothing to do with Buddhist doctrine. What did the face of your ancestors look before you were born? What? Things like that. Or I had one Zen teacher saying to me in Latin, and he said it in Latin, qui veritate opus est, si arida est. Who needs truth if it's dull? Tell me. And I just, So you quit clinging to your doctrines. Our clinging to permanence in an impermanent world, Buddhist teaching says, is the cause of our suffering. Because the more we cling, the more we shut ourselves out from the whole experiences of the world that other people have. And the result is suffering. Okay? But you have to teach yourself not to cling by looking through the delusion of your own clinging. It's a kind of reality therapy writ large, which is what Buddhist meditation does. Christian contemplative prayer does the same thing. Now, have you ever been in a Catholic church or some Christian churches, and you will see stations of the cross throughout the sanctuary? Those are meditative devices. You don't pray to them. kind of idolatrous. Okay, you only pray to God. But the device is there depicting stages of the life of the historical Jesus, from his birth to his crucifixion and resurrection. And you stay there, shut your mind down if you can, and just focus without thinking of anything else. Do you know how hard that is? Let's do an experiment. Okay, everybody sit up straight. Okay, now either put your hands in your lap like this or on the table and get your back away from the chairs. Okay, okay. Now close your eyes halfway. Try not to think of anything except silence, that you're here, starting now. Okay, relax. What happened? Let's look. What happened for you? Over there, yeah. What else? Yeah,
I got earworm going on. This was like mine.
there you go. Anybody else?
Choose the answer.
Ah, nice job, yeah. Huh? And you were aware of you being alone in a room of people. Yep. Now, even that's a thought, get rid of it in meditation. Yeah, because in a Buddhist monastery or in a Christian church, when you're with people. Okay, what else?
Breathing in and breathing out.
Well, that's how you start. You just go breathe in, hold it for 10 seconds, out for 10, back and forth, so you don't have to think about it anymore. Okay, and that takes a lot of time. This is a slow process, guys. What else? Nothing. What do you mean nothing? You had no thoughts? So have you been doing this for a while? What do you do? Good for you. Good for you. Did you learn it from a Buddhist or a Christian tradition or? Huh? Okay, good for you. It's very helpful, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. And that's what it does. And it's a form of prayer. It's a wordless prayer, my Zen teachers will say. Okay. Now, that's if you're a Buddhist, especially in the meditative forms of Buddhism, that's what you do. It's not about doctrines, although your doctrines will take you into a temple, but you leave the doctrines outside if you can. Now, we don't say that here in the church, do we? I mean, you come into the church and look what you're surrounded with. You're surrounded with images and stories about the historical Jesus we confess to be the Christ of faith. Okay? We Christians can't get rid of that, but you can set it aside in contemplative prayer. Okay? Looking at these stations of the cross, you see stories of the historical Jesus, which you meditate on, open your mind to, feel what's there until you can move on. And you get to the end, it's just simply an empty cross. There's nothing to hold on to. You are this universe looking at itself. Okay? You are what the historical Jesus was talking about. There's nothing to hold on to. Okay? Now, what do? Try to live accordingly. Give to the poor, be just, be honest, all of that stuff. And let God take care of the rest. Okay? Now, that's what happens in Christian meditation. Christian contemplative prayer. It's not an immersion into the oneness of things. It's an immersion into the oneness with Christ, who is part of who you are, even if you don't recognize it. You are this universe looking at itself. You follow? Who doesn't follow? Oh, come on, who doesn't follow? You mean, I should get a raise. Okay. Okay, what other questions?
Many friends who have rejected the church, but still profess to have Christian values, but they reject the church because of the doctrine and the judgment. Is that true of other faiths? Are they experiencing the same kind of reactions and pushback from I think large portions of our population?
That's life in the 21st century.
Yeah, so how does Christianity address that? And do we recognize that we are a part of what's happening, or do we just
Well, of course we're a part of what's happening. That's what the whole notion of sinfulness means. Okay, of course we're a part of that. But the difference is, when you recognize it, what do? You can be like most people who on Sunday morning would rather go out and walk the dog than be in here, or rather sleep in than be in here, and so on. That's okay. We shouldn't judge. We need to focus on what's going on in here and hope that it sort of flows out. The people who don't go to church around here probably have a lot of respect for the people who do, and for the ministries that are carried out here. Okay, this is a very active congregation, and it's socially engaged, as one of my Buddhist teachers said. To be religious is to be socially engaged. He even founded a form of Buddhism called socially engaged Buddhism. Okay? His name was Thich Nhat Hanh. He was a Vietnamese monk. Okay? And he led a resistance movement against the government in Vietnam during the Vietnam War for its oppression of Buddhist monks and nuns. He put it on the line. And he said, it's not a matter of labels. Our justice and our mercy goes out to everybody. That's the deal. And if they don't respond, that's their karma. That's what they get. That's up to them. Okay. And I would say the same thing about the Christian tradition. If people don't respond to whatever grace we have, there's nothing we can do about it. We just trust God. And we don't let our community fall apart because of that. So I'll go walk the dog with people, and if I'm going to go to church first, okay, because I need the community. I don't like missing going to Point of Grace because those people are wild. Okay, well, in terms of what they do, and we have a great pastor. If Point of Grace wasn't there, I'd be here, because this community is wild. And besides, I can hassle with Rick Rouse. Okay. And we were colleagues at POU, so we've been hassling a long time. Okay. So I don't think we need to worry about that question. It's a question, but there's nothing we can do about it.
No, So I've always believed that the church, part of the mission of a church is to do outreach and to try to grow your congregation and grow your community.
Oh, yeah, I have no problem with that. Yeah.
So what I heard you say is it's okay if we don't try to Are you saying it's
No,
okay that we
no.
don't try to do that?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay,
I'm saying, you do that in spite of what these folks do. You know, and you hope they respond, and some will join us in this endeavor because it's a great thing to do. Okay, it's also, I think, church membership's more fun than a rock fight in a parking lot. You know, but it's not a condition for my giving to the other people outside. They're going to do what they want to do. And that could include, oh, I see what you're doing. I want to be part of this. And I know people who joined because of this. And I know people who thanked me very much and just went on with what they were doing. And that's okay too. That's up to God to take care of, not me. My job, and I think your job, is to be as open to the world out there and to serve it with no strings attached. That seems to me what Jesus was doing, according to the stories we have about him. He didn't heal anybody with strings attached. But go and tell people what happened. He didn't say, join my group. Okay? He would not have made a good missionary in some congregations in the 21st century. Jesus was very open to the world, from what I know from the text anyway. And it doesn't mean he did everything in the world, but I don't imagine he shut himself off from it. If he did, he wouldn't have walked to the cross. He walked to it. Okay? It's what we have to do if we're going to be followers. And that means getting out in that world and doing stuff we need to do. Okay? It doesn't mean trying to go out and converting people from a street corner. You know, faith isn't something you sell. It's something you live and exhibit and portray. And if that faith is open to the world and the world's religions, what a great thing that is. I love going to the Muslim mosque in Linwood because the people there are so receptive. They don't try to convert me to anything. They just like me and I like them. No strings attached. And we talk. And they've stretched my ideas about Jesus and Christian tradition. And I know I've stretched theirs. My wife is a theologian as well. And you should see what she does to the women in this mosque and what they've done for her. It's in a very different way. I don't like the separation of men and women and the hierarchy. Islam is still a very patriarchal religion. I don't like patriarchy because that means there are women out there I can't learn from. I don't like that. Okay. She wouldn't have married me if I treated her in a patriarchal way. Okay. I'm glad she did, you know. Okay. Can I tell them how I met? No, never mind. She told me to shut up with her eye, with her eyes. Okay. So, you know, being open doesn't mean selling out your faith. Okay. But it does mean you need to know something about your tradition historically. Okay. You need to know something about other non-Lutheran traditions. You need to know something about Lutheran. I did it again, didn't I? Oh, I'm a failure. Okay. So I'm standing up because it's easier on my leg. So it means putting yourself with some disciplined study of the tradition you represent here in this church. Why are you Lutherans? What does Luther say to you that makes you come here early on a Sunday morning when you could be sleeping in, knowing you have to go to work tomorrow? Doesn't that suck? You know, why, okay, you're retired. why doesn't it suck? Okay, I suspect because you love the community that's here, you love the people who's here. Your pastor's a heck of a preacher. Okay, you guys have got a great social engagement going on here. You work in the community. Okay, you work with other Lutheran denominations, like Point of Grace. You also feed the poor. You know, you also take political stances that reflect your Lutheran views of life, and you don't care who disagrees with you or not. You know, you do your thing, and you do it because you have a community that supports you. Now, if you lived in the 15th century with Luther, 16th century, you would not be in dialogue with any tradition because they were very much locked against each other. Okay. Tradition that became Episcopalian began to develop in England under Henry VIII. Luther was spreading his view of Christian tradition, which wasn't like Melanchthon, who was one of his disciples. Nor was it like Jonathan Edwards, nor was it like the Presbyterian folks. Okay. And they wouldn't talk to each other. They wouldn't be in dialogue. They were saying my way, or no highways in those days, but my way or the highway. Okay. And it was that way for most of our history up until the middle of the last century, when people were beginning to say, no, let's got to think there's other highways. I can learn from these other people. I don't have to give up my own tradition to do that. But if I do, I'm taking a risk. Because my tradition is going to change and be different. The more I learn about my faith, even learning about your faith will change it. Did you know that? The more you know about the Lutheran tradition will make you a different Lutheran than you are now. It'll make you a different Christian than you are now. The more you know about Buddhism will make you a different Christian than you are now. The more you engage with Muslim brothers and sisters as brothers and sisters, you're a different Lutheran. Okay? Doesn't mean you're going to give it up, but you've changed it. You've expanded it. You've become less parochial. And the job of religious faith is to make you less parochial. I've told my students for 44 years, okay? Which is why I sometimes got in trouble with their parents, you know? Okay? If you go to church because you think this is the only way, you're not going to have a very good time in church. Because no pastor I know is going to teach you that. You didn't hear that this morning, servant. You heard some other things that were incredible. She knows what she's doing. This is one of the reasons I'm in favor of Lutheran women becoming pastors, because you get a more open tradition, you get better preaching, frankly, and you don't get so much dogmatism. That's just me, but that's true, at least in my church, and at least I think here. Okay. So anyway, I've talked too much. What else?
Okay, question.
Yes, I like that too. Yep. I don't either.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands, we wipe them out. And had we stopped and studied them and asked them, what do they believe? I think we would have found, like I did, I was raised in Montana, close to Browning, Montana, where the Blackfeet Indian.
Oh, yes, I've been there.
Okay, if you've been to Glacier Park, you've been across going to the Sun Highway. The Blackfeet Indian had an awareness of a greater entity that ruled them. It was a sun god. When they had a drought and the berries were growing and the buffalo were not feeding and the antelope had gone away and they were starving, they said, we have to go to our sun god. And we understand there's some folks on the other side of those mountains, those Rocky Mountains, and we hear they've got a good thing going over there because they have lots of rain on the west side of the mountains in the Flathead Valley. And we're going to send somebody over there and see if they can bring back some of that rain to us, because the sun god will help us do that. So going to the sun highway was their highway to God, to their divine entity. They were worshiping what we worship as God.
Well, I think so. And I don't have any trouble with that. The Haida had a notion similar. And they identified it with the sun, and Raven was a messenger. Lakota did the same thing. The Apache did the same thing. Navajo had a very complicated theocracy. Okay, and so did the native traditions in Mexico and South America. I didn't exclude them here because I didn't have time. I have 2 weeks. I thought I'd just deal with the world's Western religions.
I think we've kind of
Well, it was
different
well they managed not to have religious war. Yeah.
we're giving, asking for forgiveness.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are.
We're sitting on it right now.
Well, we lived on the land that used to belong to the Puyallups in Tacoma.
That's what, I think we should not dismiss that because they are our neighbors and they are our immediate.
Well, I don't think I dismissed that. I just was thinking about time.
I wasn't speaking of that, but they are a smaller religious group and they're our immediate neighbors. And so I think we need to be aware and cognizant.
Well, what you should do is find yourself an expert on Native American traditions and invite him to do 2 weeks. I'll talk to Rip Rouse about that.
Oh, it's fantastic. Everybody should go.
And we go up there and hold they were very.
The retired teachers have done that. We were going to plan another session for this year, but with the construction on the freeway between here and Marysville. My daughter lives in Marysville.
Oh, that's rough. That's rough. Yeah. Well, now, here's a suggestion. If you have time, it doesn't take a lot of time, but if you have time, get a hold of a book by Houston Smith called The Religions of the World. Okay? Now, that thing reads like a novel, but it's got all the major ideas of Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, even Native American stuff in it. And use that as a kind of foundational text to kind of deepen what you've learned the last 2 weeks here. Okay? That would be my first thing. And then, if you want to keep this kind of discussion going, which I hope you do, there are other excellent people who can help you with this. There's a guy at POU, a woman at POU, who's a specialist in indigenous religions in the Pacific Northwest. Her name is Suzanne Crawford O'Brien, and she lives in Seattle, so it's not a big commute. And she would be a good one to invite to do a couple of weeks here. So write her down, Suzanne Crawford O'Brien. Okay, Tell her Paul sent you. Okay? Okay. And that would be a good way to keep this conversation going. And to also to bleed into your questions. Okay?
Thank you.
It's kind of tribal, but, what can we say to our, Jewish and Palestinian neighbors? It's, I mean, I went to Israel in '77, you know, it was bad then, but not. How in our tradition can we help them? You know, it's just been since Old Testament times.
You can help them, but not oppressing them.
Yeah.
Jews are the most oppressed religion in the history of the world. Okay, so they're not ready to talk to people outside of the Jewish community unless they trust you. And you got to establish that trust. Now, my brother-in-law trusts me because we have good conversations. And he introduced me to his rabbi who didn't trust me. And so we just did small talk. Yeah, you start with that and see where it goes. There's nothing else you can do. If somebody doesn't want to dialogue with you, that's the end of the dialogue. Okay? There's nothing you can do about it, but you need to be open. Okay? And so start out by saying, Shalom Aleichem. Peace be with you. Okay? And then you might want to, if he has a sense of humor, you can say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed art thou, O Lord of the God, O Lord of the, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe. And they'll say, oh, maybe they'll talk to you. And they may even laugh because your Hebrew isn't very good, you know, but you tried. And I just find that with my Jewish friends, I just listen. And there comes a time when they want to say, what do you think? And I tell them what I think, but in a very careful way until the conversation just opens up. My sister-in-law, my wife's sister, married a Jewish man and actually became a Jewish lady and does all the rituals in her household that women do. Like serving the Seder meal on Good Friday. She starts out with candles, blowing the smoke over her body as she says Baruch atah, so on. And I think that's wonderful. I don't think her relation to God is imperiled at all because she used to be a Lutheran, became Jewish, Reformed Jewish, but nevertheless Jewish. Now, very conservative Jews are going to ask you, why do you want to talk to me? And they might not want to talk to you, the very Orthodox Jews. But Orthodox Christians do the same thing, very Orthodox Christians. There are people who cling to their faith, cling to their tradition like a crutch. And they're not open to discussions. And so you don't try unless they ask you some questions. It doesn't do any good. It's not going to be a dialogue. And they want you to be part of their tradition when you're not really a human being. You have dialogue depends upon seeing the other person not as other, but as a human being who has something to offer to you, and you have something to offer them, and now you can talk. We don't talk enough. That's the problem. Does that make any sense? I made sense today. I can't believe it. Oh. Well, my wife is saying I have 3 minutes. There's also a large community of Muslims. In fact, they're surrounded by Muslims. That's a very dangerous place to live right now. I don't know what to tell you about that. So we keep our lives together. We keep our lives open. We're Lutherans. That's what we are called to do. Okay? The most Lutheran thing you can do right now is be engaged in interreligious dialogue, in my opinion. The most Christian thing you can do is to do that with humility, with openness, and not with selling out your own tradition, but understanding it and deepening your understanding so you have a point of view from which to engage. Follow? That's why we have liberal arts colleges to do that sort of thing for our students. It doesn't always work, but nevertheless. Okay? So I'm going to be quiet now and say thank you for inviting my wife and I here. You guys are terrific. And I really mean that. If I wasn't at Point of Grace, I'd be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.